thank you all for joining this session on building for scalability. It's a question I think about a lot. As I saw Dev Day come up, it had been something I'd been writing a bit about, sketching some ideas about, and decided, okay, time to actually come out and talk about some of this stuff. I want to shout out Brenton Strine and some of the team that I work with on one project, Ranjit Bing in particular, for giving some early feedback on these ideas that I've been thinking a lot about. So this is Building for Scalability. I'm Brian Alderman, been around no code for about 5 years and around software my whole career. I think no code's a technological superpower. We all can enable businesses to modernize and compete in ways that were totally inaccessible to many entrepreneurs. But I also think we, the superheroes exercising our no-code superpowers, can get in our own way on that path to fully using that superpower. So from the hundreds of apps I've seen, scores of business builders I've talked to, building and maintaining dozens of apps over the years, some of which have grown substantially, I've come upon what I think are some limits to no-code scalability and bubble scalability specifically for our purposes today. And I've formed some opinions of things that I think we as a community need to do better to overcome these limits. And that's what I'm hoping to explore today, starting with what do I mean by scalability? It's probably not what you think. 10 things, 10 practices that I would suggest we think about more for scalability, and we can wrap this up really as a discussion. A Q&A if possible, given this limited format, but this is the beginning of a discussion, not the end, about what we as a bubble development community can do to improve the scalability of the apps that we work on. Before I get into that in detail, though, one disclaimer: these are all my opinions, pretty high-level practices we're going to go through, I hope still useful, and I'll be the first to admit that I've never actually built an app that follows every single one of these practices as well as I'd want to. I strive to get closer to it every single time, but the reality of software is that there's no such thing as perfect and no such thing as done. There's just what you release out into the world and how you iterate on that going forward. Rough consensus in running code is what the Agile Manifesto says. I'm a big believer in that. And as much as I talk in more of an academic way about some of these practices, it's really what we ship that matters. So that said, let's get into it. The question I get asked all the time is, can Bubble scale? The glib answer is really very simple. Yes, for basically any use case and company, Bubble can scale. The places that I would caveat right now are deep data things, data analysis work, and places where compliance challenges pop up, for instance, in the US, HIPAA-related challenges. But, and there's a big but behind that, yes, you have to build it right. The tool itself, Bubble, won't stop you from building something that doesn't scale, but it does enable you to build something that can scale. I get approached by clients all the time with apps that they or someone else, maybe some of you listening on this call, have built for them. They come to me because something's not working right. They've hit a wall, they can't figure out how to get over a stability or a fragility hump, or they feel they've gone down a dead-end path. You've probably seen and inherited and worked in apps like this. One hallmark is that they feel fragile or buggy to build in or run. I've come across one personal finance app I was in fairly recently that was built in such a way that users complained about its feelings of fragility, and eventually that killed the company and killed the app. So that fragility is a real business problem that has to be solved. And that fragility, I find, usually comes from certain decisions made early in development that lead to the app being non-scalable. This class of problem is really hard to rectify once it gets introduced. I often have to advise clients I'm talking to that to fix those kinds of problems that they're identifying, the best path is often to start over. And that's not something that they usually want to hear. In many cases, it's because it's the first app that they've built. That's great. Build your first app, get started, get building. That's important. But sometimes it's better to just build wrong and start as opposed to not starting at all. But don't be surprised if you've got to throw it all out and come back later to meet your larger ambitions and goals. I've seen hundreds of Bubble apps, and there's very few that I think meet the definition of what I would call built right for the purposes of scalability. That can't be blamed on people just building their first apps. I think it is a larger challenge that comes from a lack of recognition in the Bubble community about what right looks like for the sake of scalability. And that is crucial to our collective future as Bubble developers. For no code and Bubble to have a trusted reputation, we as developers have to build more things right along the way. There's one important point I have to make before we get too far into this, though, which is that I'm talking here about apps that are intended to run businesses or be built for the long term. There's an important and valid place in the no-code ecosystem for prototypes, things that are intended to be built fast and cheaply with the intention of testing an idea. If that's what you're building, keep doing what you're doing. Most of the principles we're going to talk about for the rest of this session won't really apply. Some of them are good practices, some of them can help you out. But what I'm really talking about here is the trade-offs that are made along this iron triangle of speed, quality, and cost. With prototypes, you're really in that speed and cost, minimizing cost, maximizing speed, right? Get something out the door, test the idea. But as we wander more into the territory of minimal viable products, MVPs, and beyond, the quality aspect becomes much more important, and you inevitably have to slow down and spend more money to achieve the same functionality in a more scalable way. There's a trap in MVPs in particular, which is a bit beyond the scope of this conversation today, but worth a mention, which is that when someone says the word MVP, they may and often mean something more scalable and less minimum than we as developers often interpret it to be, especially if they have expectations of running a fully fledged business on that MVP. It's worth a deeper consideration of just how viable the app that you're building really needs to be for that business. I think of one particular client from about 6 months ago who brought a directory app to me that's what I would call a fine, functional, minimum viable product, but that they were deeply unhappy with. They didn't consider it viable because it was missing some key internal business operations functions. And I was able to help them build out more tooling, but it got much more expensive and slower to build on than they were hoping. And we ended up parting on not great terms, and they lost a lot of trust in Bubble as a tool along the way. So, and I credit Ranjit Bing, who did a session earlier today for this thought. The definition of right that we're going to talk about here changes based on the intention of the thing you're building. The right thing for prototypes is a very different right thing for an app that you're trying to scale. And that's where we're going to focus for the rest of this session. So what's scale all about here? Well, let's talk about what it's not. It's not about concurrent users or loading speed or database size or workload units, at least not directly. On all of those factors, Bubble apps can and have scaled. I've seen apps with tens of millions of database rows. I've seen apps with great lighthouse scores and fast page load speeds. I've not personally seen apps that handle thousands of concurrent users, but I've heard from others that they exist. All of that kind of scale is very possible to achieve on Bubble, though it may be expensive. Think spending on dedicated instances and thousands of dollars a year in hosting or workload costs. Scale's not free, nor is it cheap. That's not unique to Bubble, though. Scaled web systems outside the Bubble environment are also expensive. I'd argue even more so, since you have to hire the people to build and maintain that infrastructure in the first place. One big advantage of Bubble is they do that for us. So my point is that scalability here is not technical scalability. What I'm proposing that scalability, in particular the barriers to scalability for Bubble apps are three things. First, it's about resisting the temptation to build fast, which is super easy to do with no code, but can lead you down unstable pathways. It's about overcoming problems inherent to Bubble's tight integration and decreased modularity. The gold that is having an integrated database and front end that Bubble gives us is incredibly useful, but also really dangerous from a scalability perspective. And then figuring out how to collaborate with larger teams, inevitable when you're growing a larger company and application, becomes fairly difficult in Bubble. So over these next 10 slides, we're going to look at 10 practices I've put together that I think can help with this as you build, and things to think about along the way. So the first one seems a little trite. Keep your app simple, consistent, and organized. Bubble and no code in general is a high-level programming language. Bubble will talk about it as far as programming business logic. So I would propose that your apps in general should make sense at a glance to someone who knows your business and knows some basics of how Bubble works or computer language works, but hasn't necessarily seen your app before. The test is, Show your app or a feature that you're building to a colleague who hasn't seen what you've built before, especially someone who's less technical than even you are as a bubble developer, and see if they can puzzle out what it does. I've gotten into birding over the last couple of years. So I, as an example of this, put together just this simple example. Can you determine what these submit buttons do? Just by looking at the workflows. So if I trace the workflow through and hit that submit button, I say, okay, it checks the input and then it adds to life list if the correct answer is yes, right? So even here, without going into the make changes to the database or any of that other stuff, you can see that I've used custom events to make it very clear what this submit button does. It checks the input, and then if it's the correct answer is yes, it passes the input. And I could look even deeper into here and say, okay, it takes an input, it takes the correct answer, checks those things, and I could go in and look at how does that check input work. I can see it does some erroring. I can see it does some cleaning of the inputs to make sure they match, right? But from a very high level, I can click on these submit buttons and I can know what's it going to do. There's no confusion about that in these workflows. This is obviously way simplified, but the principle remains. You should be able to decompose and understand what every step of your app does at a glance along the way, as long as you've got some reasonable context about the use case. There's a bunch of other practices that can help you stay consistent and organized and simple. I've listed some of my favorite ones down here, right? This is all about how you structure your reusables and backend workflows. It's about the old programming adage, do not repeat yourself or dry, making sure you're not using magic numbers, lots of other good basic practices. If you want more on that, check out Codeless Love's best practices efforts, as well as there's a post floating around the Bubble forum called The Golden Rules of Software. It's terrific. I recommend going to go look at it. I like keeping my workflow short, right? More than 8 steps is a smell to me that I've done something too complex. Make sure you're following good database design principles. We're not going to go into that in detail here, but there's a lot been written about it. Go follow it, go learn about your database design. And most importantly here, just be consistent with yourself. I don't have particular recommendations about, or even things that I follow about how groups get named, how variables get named, how fields get named, etc. As long as you're consistent within your app, with yourself, you're good. Consistent everything. That goes beyond naming, right? It goes into gaps and spacing. Be consistent internally to your app everywhere that you possibly can be. Number 2, responsiveness is mandatory. It's the modern web. Almost every app you build, a huge portion of users will be in mobile browsers. Even if you're not building for mobile, people will use it in mobile, and people can resize their computer screens in browsers, right? Even if I'm in a desktop screen, that doesn't mean I'm at a desktop size window. So we have to build responsively in the modern web. And too often I see folks build very pretty, but too wide pages and not consider responsiveness along the way. You've got to really understand how your bubble flexbox works, the container layouts work, how your elements are sized to make your app fully responsive from day one. I love using the responsiveness builder. It's like I'll be in here and I'll mess with pages as I'm building primarily in the responsiveness builder. And I really like avoiding magic numbers, right? So here's an example of this looked fine, large, but as I shrink it down, oh, I've got, I think this top one's a fixed width here. I never use fixed width basically anywhere. I think it's an anti-pattern because it means your apps are just a little less scalable. Things too, like being careful of fit width to content, which I think is what's going on here, because that in certain responsiveness cases can be too long or narrow. So you've got to be good at responsiveness from day one. It's not optional. Got to do it. Number 3. For now, I think avoiding templates and avoiding AI build tools is the way to go if you're building from scalability. Even with the announcements Bubble was making about their AI approaches today, those are future announcements, and we'll see how much they can realize the promise of it. I think they're thinking about AI in the right way, but we haven't seen it actually working yet. So for now, avoid templates and avoid AI build tools. I've built from templates a few times, and every single time I've regretted it. I've had folks come to me to customize templates, and I'd suggest for the most part that they don't end up customizing the templates, they just fully replace them. It's a little bit Ship of Theseus, where the thing that you wind up with is nothing like the template that you started with. The main reason why is all about imposed structure. The templates you work from in the AI builder will give your app a structure that you end up fighting along the way. And you'll be constantly cleaning it up in terms of consistency, like rule number 1 we talked about a minute ago, and organization. You start out from a deficit when you use AI build tools or templates and will never really recover. There's also a piece here about how templates in particular are generic, whereas your app's use case is very much not generic. You're building for a specific purpose. And you'll spend more time adapting the template to your design and your use case than you would have if you'd started building from scratch in the first place. If you've ever built from a template, I'd encourage you, go back and look at that app today and see how much of it resembles the template that you started with. And ask yourself the question, would I have started the same way or not? With Bubble AI specifically, I'm a little bit of a skeptic on AI build tools at a high level. We'll see if Bubble can pull off what their ambition is. I'm excited about it. But I think Bubble AI is just a little bit of a different beast than a lot of lower level AI code tools. If you've ever played with true code AI tools, they help you maybe write a function, write a line of code. They're not, in most cases, building an entire page or an entire app when responsibly used. And Bubble's tools, at least to date, have been building an entire app. And we wind up with some scalability and organization problems as a result. I'm excited to be disappointed or surprised on that front. I think the AI build tools can be pretty exciting. They're just not there yet. What is encouraged, though, is you should be pulling your lower level components from design libraries. Think Atomic Fusion as one good example. Frames, I think, is still kicking around as a good design library out there, or your own internal app you can copy and paste from, as long as they're organized in a way that makes sense to you and is modular and can remain consistent in a style that matches the rest of your app. Speaking of which, you need a design system, and you need to build and use it religiously. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. As you can tell from my slides, I'm not really a visual designer. I lean really heavily on well-built design systems, and so should you. They make your app just feel more consistent and more well-built. I think Gregory John's design guide for Bubble is an excellent place to start if you're building a design system. There's a couple hallmarks I'll use when I look for a good scalable design system. I think it starts in your global styles. Having a set of specific but not too specific global styles is important. This is an example on the left here of one personal finance app I've been working in recently. It's got maybe 30 styles across the whole app here. None of them are too specific, and it works for basically every use case across the app. We're not really customizing these on an element by element basis. I also really love the trick of setting components in your reusables and then detaching them into your app to make sure you're constantly consistent on things like spacing, or if you've got animations going about how your inputs work. Those can be good ways to pull them in using that detach reusable feature. And finally, you need a set of rules and conventions for your app that don't get saved in global styles or components. Things like, what icon library do you use? What's your standard way of doing gaps and margins? Make sure you're always consistent about that through your app. And if there's features like dark modes or database conditional theming, you've got to be consistent about that on every page and every element that you build. There was a complex app I was working on, a multi-tenant SaaS app that let a company add their own styling and branding, which meant that every single element in the app had a set of conditionals that we had to write the same way every time, or more like copy the same way every time, to make sure that the styling applied correctly. This was pretty complex. The conditional was not a simple one, but because we had conventions and a standard up front, we were able to make it work. In a similar-ish vein, let's talk about nav systems. Your app's nav system should embed your app's information architecture in a robust and nicely resilient way. This will be one of the most frequently interacted with elements of your entire application, so it's got to be perfect. Too often I see in apps that I'm auditing unnecessary fragility in the nav system. Things like text being set in URL parameters that's then referenced in multiple visibility conditions. So on like a go to page action, you're typing in a text of a page name versus using what I would suggest, which is an option set that's the option set you refer to every time you refer to that page. That way, if you're missing a reference or need to change a page name later, you don't accidentally miss something in the core navigation of your application. There's probably at least one option set involved in your nav system. Like in this one, our entire, like this app has like 6 pages in here that'll show up, but we just use a repeating group to generate that on the fly from an option set. And it means we're not worrying about breaking it anytime we change or add a page. This is also a key responsive component, right? So by doing a nav system right, I make sure that the rest of the app responsively works nicely around it. There's been a ton written about single page versus multi-page apps, how to build a good nav bar, build good headers. All of that's good and valid. The most important thing is that you take the time to build a robust and systemic nav system upfront. Next, I want to talk about authorization and privacy rules. This is maybe the most important slide of this entire talk. If you take nothing more away from our 40 minutes together here today, then please take this. Please, 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 whenever you add a data type, the first thing that you do should be to go consider your privacy rules first. I am begging you. I can't count the number of times that people bring me apps to audit or advise on, and I'll look at it and I'll see 0 privacy rules set up. Often, because of where I specialize, which is in financial applications, this data contains users' sensitive financial data. Not only does this expose that app's user data, but it potentially undermines the trust in the Bubble ecosystem as a whole. Every instance of data leaking from a Bubble app will make people wonder if Bubble can be trusted to scale. And the worst part is that Bubble provides us, the developers, all the tools we need to eliminate that risk. It's the developers like you and I not using those rules properly that can cause a problem for the whole community. So we've got to set up our privacy rules first. And to appropriately set up our privacy rules first, we've got to design and implement an authorization system up front. So zooming out a little bit, what's authorization? Authorization is broadly about what data and functions a user should have access to. Unless you're truly building a public site, which I think is pretty rare in the Bubble ecosystem, you'll need an authorization system. Whatever system you implement, it's going to show up primarily in 4 areas of your app. Each of these can be explored in a lot more detail in the Bubble manual, and I also highly recommend reading Peter Amelie's Bubble security book. Every developer needs to understand these topics. You could also go watch George's presentation from earlier today, which I think was an excellent dive into the why behind a couple of these particular methods of protection. So let's walk through these briefly. If I have a good auth system, then the first thing I can do is build privacy rules that use that auth system and make sure that the data is protected, as well as in auto-binding and API use cases, who can update that data is appropriately protected and only given to properly authorized users. The second layer of it is page protection. So this is the basic, who can get into certain pages of my app in a server-side way. I won't go too much more into that. There's been a lot of good stuff said about server-side redirects, and that's really what I'm talking about here. The bottom 2 layers are not implemented nearly enough, I think, in the Bubble ecosystem. One is about workflow protection. So this is about making sure whenever, in particular, you're changing data or doing some action with an API on behalf of your users, that you check a server-side, not an element-related condition in the workflow to make sure it is running in a secure way. And then the last one is the visible components of this. This is number 4 for a reason. It's the last piece of consideration here. It doesn't actually protect anything from a security perspective, but if you do these first 3, your users will have a terrible time if you don't do the 4th one. And this is just about hiding or making elements not clickable when the authorization, which in this case, I've just got a very simple auth system, permissions doesn't contain a flag, life list. I've just set that up as an option set. Then that button wouldn't be visible. Your app's use case will dictate exactly how you do authorization. It can be as simple as the user's logged in to much more complex use cases, like what happens with multi-tenant SaaS products that have data access and feature rules. There's one app I was working in recently, a SaaS product for dance studios, vertical SaaS. It had these concepts of tenants and roles. A user could live in multiple tenants and have multiple roles, where each of those roles granted access to certain granular features and data. What made any of that possible is we spent time up front to define that authorization structure so that we could implement it consistently. Finally, I think Bubble's acquisition of Flusk last year was a huge win for trust and security. You absolutely should be using Flusk to analyze and monitor your applications, but know that it's not perfect. It can't test for every scenario, and it doesn't know your specific use case or authorization schema. You still have to do the work of building a secure app using some of these tools around building authorization. Number 7. This is potentially one of the more contentious scalability suggestions that I'll make today. I think we should minimize the use of custom HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as minimize the use of plugins as much as possible. Your first choice when building in the Bubble ecosystem should be using Bubble native features. There's a ton you can do with native Bubble, groups, dropdowns, inputs, etc., especially for integrations and visual elements. It may just take a bit of work and creativity to get Bubble looking and feeling like you want it to. I know a search and dropdown combo component comes up all the time. You can absolutely build that with native Bubble. You don't need a plugin. And I'd suggest not using plugins whenever you can. There's a bunch of reasons for this avoidance of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You avoid heavy third-party libraries that can slow your pages down. You avoid regression issues if and when Bubble makes changes in the future. They guarantee their own software and they'll fix bugs on it, but they won't really help you with plugin stuff. I've had a number of cases where Bubble will change something and it breaks plugins, right? If you avoid plugins in the first place, you avoid that problem. This helps reduce risk of data leaks through malicious code or APIs. You avoid black box areas of your app that you don't understand and can't troubleshoot. For example, I recently was using a calendar plugin that had a CSS class interfering with another plugin's CSS class, and it was an absolute nightmare to debug. So that's the kind of black box that you can avoid. And it makes it easier to lose track of what the heck your app is doing if you have JavaScript and CSS and HTML going on all over the place. So these are things you should do when necessary, but only really when necessary. There are places that sometimes especially JavaScript magic, comes in handy. These are some plugin stacks of some apps that I've built recently, including some really complex ones. And you'll notice they have 7 to 14 plugins in here. I've seen apps that have 40 plus plugins installed. Really? This is about all you need. 7 to 14 for even the prettiest, most complex apps. There are some plugins and things that are just hard to do with native Bubble. Anything that touches the API connector or talking to external APIs, absolutely valid. Use a plugin, right? Certain Bubble built elements like the multi-select dropdown toolbox that enables you to add JavaScript, very handy. The CSV uploader and creator things that Eli's made, as well as the input watcher, can be really handy. And then anything related to analytics and tools, tracking headers, that all can be very handy to use at the plugin or the custom code level. You also always have the option of building your own plugin. I know there was a session on that. I'm getting started with plugin development earlier today. And I think that's a great way to go about things that are a little more complex, that are really important for your specific use case. So don't do that if it is generic, but if it really is about what exactly you're trying to do, absolutely go do it. I see rich text and PDF generation come up a lot there if we're looking for a very specific way of working in those two functionalities. That has led me to go build a plugin and launch into that low code over no code direction as a result. We've had success with that in a couple of places. In a similar vein, or kind of maybe contradictory vein, I encourage you to really understand your payment flows, especially, and this includes also not using plugins for your payment flows. I encourage you to build your payment flows using the API connector and Toolbox JavaScript. It doesn't take much. Yeah, I know this contradicts my previous page a little bit, but this is a place where I think JavaScript is appropriate when you are building just your payments element and you want to really have control over its look and feel. I'll admit this may be a little bit of a perspective problem for me. I see some of the most complex payment scenarios out there. It's what I specialize in. These are delayed payment methods, multi-party payments, unusual marketplace structures, things that the Bubble Stripe plugin definitely cannot handle. But I also think payments, even for simpler use cases, are key to most of your apps and your businesses. And I think that you can't, as a developer, hide from those details. You need to go spend the time in the Stripe documentation and really understand it. And yeah, Stripe is the place to start for 99% of apps. They can support almost anything out there. They have some of the best documentation out there. And if you can interpret Stripe docs into Bubble language, you will have a better payment system than most other applications. This really isn't that crazy hard, right? So here's one very simple example of payments. It's an API connector value. I've set that up in this app already. All it's doing is a single API call to the checkout sessions flow, and then a button here that uses that API connector flow to create a checkout session and runs a little bit of JavaScript. And I just took this and interpreted it directly from Stripe's docs. It's, what is this, like 4 lines of JavaScript. And if I go into preview mode and hit that Pay Now button, all it does is mount the payment element right there on my page. I've not had to use a plugin for this. It's API connector and JavaScript only, and gives me a payment experience that I, as the developer, fully control. Most important, though, is that you really understand all the details of your payment implementation. Number 9, this is one I struggle a little bit with how to articulate. Work cleanly and efficiently. Obviously, we all try to work cleanly and efficiently, but doing this becomes way more important as your app scales up in order to keep you working effectively and enable the growth of the development team. Bubble is inherently a monolith. All the functionality changes and gets released together. And that means you as a development team need to implement practices that take this into consideration and reduce risk as your team grows, your app grows in complexity, and you need more processes. The most important thing is to have a process. Beyond that, there's a couple practical suggestions I would offer. Things like merging and releasing regularly. A healthy app is one that's released constantly. Multiple times a day is a good thing. Minimizing the aging on your branches, right? Less than 2 days and less than 50 changes per merge is kind of what I look for. Keep changes small, keep branches short-lived. Don't build tons of big things. It offers too many opportunities for stuff to go wrong as you merge it in. This involves using feature flags. How do you get changes to be that small? You've got to use your feature flagging permissions to hide features that aren't ready for users yet that you're still working on, but still let you move forward with implementing them. I also suggest fixing forward. If you're releasing all the time, this gets a lot easier. You're never really reverting. You're just fixing problems as they come up and managing that change as it comes up. And then finally, just don't copy down data from live to dev. There's really no reason to ever do that. It's a terrible security and data privacy practice. And what it means if you find yourself in a case where you need to do that is that you haven't spent the time to build your test data appropriately. Take the time, build a set of test data that matches what you're seeing users do in live, and lean on that data to test on regularly. There's also some modularity things you can do with reusable elements and turning those into objects. Guillaume Maison did some really good work about object-oriented programming and reusable elements that helps things be modular, which I think is really interesting work. And you can also get even more complex. I've had one client that I work with that's outgrown just one app. We actually have 3 with developers that work independently on those different apps, and those apps all integrate to each other through APIs because that was the right choice for the problems we were working on and the way the problem broke down. The final tip that I would offer, practice that I would offer, is that we as Bubble developers really need to tackle this technology legal interface. This is one that I suspect most of us don't find to be the most enjoyable or fun part of our jobs as Bubble developers, but we have to deal with it. We're the responsible technical expert in the room to collaborate with your legal folks and with your business folks to make sure that our apps are compliant and following the relevant laws. Most of us weren't trained in this at all. There are tools that can help us, cookie management tools, terms of service generators, but they don't take away the responsibility we as Bubble developers have to make sure our app is in a good regulatory state. Places you can start, right? Have you read your app's terms of service and privacy policy, and do you understand it? You need to, because ultimately you as the developer are responsible for making sure that the promises found in those legal documents are implemented in your Bubble app. If something there doesn't make sense or match how you've implemented it, that needs to be a conversation and raise suggested changes or change your app accordingly. It's when I've done that at different companies, it's made the company better and safer from a regulatory perspective as a result. This gets into technical stuff too, right? Do you really understand how Bubble is setting cookies and using temporary data, and that matches the cookie policies and requirements of the regions your users are in? If you're using a cookie management tool, do you know how it's been implemented? Did you do it right? If you're using email marketing tools, or even in some places sending transactional emails, are you following local requirements for opting in? And have you all read Bubble's terms of service and privacy policy and understand what Bubble promises to do with your users' data and how they think about it? You should. It's a good read, a little dry, sure, but it's interesting and it's clearly laid out what Bubble does with your data, and we as builders have to understand that and advise the businesses we work on accordingly. This goes even further. Like, do you know all the places your data is shared? What APIs do you connect to? What data do you send to them of your users? And does that match the agreements that you've made with your users about how you're treating their data? This gets into, in particular in Europe, sub-processors. And what are all the sub-processors that you deal with? These questions get complex. You don't have to answer them on your own, but most developers, founders, and entrepreneurs don't even know where to start, which is just to ask all those questions. That's the place to start and to have a conversation. But we need to do it, and we need to do it much more regularly. So with that, I've come to the end of my list of practices for making your Bubble apps more scalable. I've included an 11th one on this list down here at the bottom, which is to use a tag manager, a little beyond the scope of what we'll talk about today. If you're doing anything with advertising or analytics, you should use a tag manager. It will make your life easier. My hope with this is that we as a Bubble developer community can build more apps right, which in turn will keep proving out that Bubble isn't just a prototype building tool. It's a platform that can change the way businesses work, making it easier, faster, and cheaper to build the technology that our world runs on. And the apps that we build can scale along with those businesses. I hope some of these practices will help you think about how you build your apps a little differently, and that you'll consider them tomorrow when you log into the editor and start making some changes. You can get all the slides here at this link, lostsheep.dev/devday2025 if you're interested. My email's on the screen. Feel free to drop me a note or find me on the Bubble forum. I would love any feedback and thoughts on some of these practices and what I've talked about today. I appreciate all of your time, and I'm looking forward to any questions or further discussion. I don't think I've seen any questions pop up yet. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right place. But if folks have them, feel free to drop them. Thanks for the kudos of building this in the Bubble editor. I thought I might regret that, Jagdish, but I'm kind of glad I did. It wasn't too terrible. And I liked having the interactive ability there. So if anyone has questions, do drop those into chat. Or even thoughts, initial thoughts to this. I'd love to hear it. Or send me an email. Go for it. Can I make you a... I don't know if I can actually make you a...
You can, here, I'll do it.
Gish, if you want to throw out your question, go for it. I think I just invited you to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you for an excellent presentation. One of the questions that always comes up when we talk about scale is database volumes and data processing and stuff like that. And, you know, we're all dealing from time to time with clients that either apps are not built well and therefore can't handle the volume of data that they want, or they're built well, but they are at a volume of data which Bubble can no longer handle efficiently. What has been your experience with using external database outside of Bubble? And do you have any recommendations on which way to go if the app seems to be built well, but we're having the too much data problem?
Yeah, so the too much data problem. I will say that for a well-built app, I don't really think the limit exists within Bubble until you're like, there's a scale at which it exists. If you are Facebook, you're going to have problems with the database. It may be more expensive and you may need to talk to Bubble about some of their dedicated options, but from a data scalability perspective, it can handle it if the database is built right. And that also might mean spending the time to change your database structure to make it function better. That said, there's a couple times where I have gone with external databases. The primary one being a compliance reason, whether I want to avoid data transfer, international data transfers, or other compliance data sharing things like HIPAA in the US.
Right.
In those cases, I have gone to Xano, and I really like Xano as a tool for that. A lot of the same practices we talked about today about building for scalability apply to in Xano, about making sure you're building clean and consistent. Right? It can run into all of the same scalability if you're not careful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
The other thought I'd have around that, if you have really high external system calling volume, you may need another tool between your endpoints and Bubble or your endpoints and even Xano to make that work. So like an Internet of Things use case, trying to stream all that data into Bubble is just going to be kind of a nightmare. Could it theoretically handle it? Yeah, but it's not really meant for that kind of high data volume use case. And that's a place where I'd look at HookDeck or something similar. They can have some different strategies. But I think Bubble can go a lot further than most people take it. And I think when I hear concerns about data volume in Bubble, I lump it more often into the bucket of built right than I do the bucket of can't handle the data.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in fact, I should probably reframe the question. This is a situation that I'm in where the app wasn't built right. And sometimes clients want a shorter path to a better outcome for their clients than refactoring and getting the app right. It may sound like a band-aid, but sometimes
that's hard.
Yeah, that's what the client wants. So another question is, have you had any experience with Superbase?
I have not personally, but I know people really like it.
Okay.
Sorry,
I've
I can't
heard the
say
same
more
as
about
well,
that,
but
no
no direct
I have not
experience
played with it myself. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a question about how you handle
Thank you.
onboarding clients who need to migrate a large volume of data with some related tables. I think you're right. Using the API can be challenging, but got to do it. But you're going to run into that problem basically no matter what database system you're on. You've got to rebuild those relationships somehow. There's probably strategies you can take about using like bulk uploaders with indices and then rebuilding those indices or the connections later using processing time or API workflows like to parse through the whole data. But it's possible. It's a problem that's hard in no matter what database. So like with Xano, in the US, our healthcare system is really weird in the US, right? There's a requirement for hospitals to produce the pricing for everything that they can ever work on. These result in these JSON files of pricing of healthcare procedures that are like a 7 gigabyte JSON file. Gigantic data, right? So I had to go put that into a place that we could query it. So take that JSON, turn it into a SQL database. Used Xano for this. And even that, it was really hard to deal with that volume of data. It ended up being like 55 million rows that we were importing to another database. It's not easy no matter where you go. We had chosen that tool for healthcare, Xano for healthcare reasons, right? But it's migrating large data volumes is hard kind of no matter what you do. Any other questions, thoughts? Bob, I hope that kind of spoke to that migrating large data volumes to another database question as well. If you can get it flat, you can use upload features. They're fairly stable, but rebuilding relationships is always hard. Well, I appreciate everyone stopping in. Feel free to drop me a note. Would love to hear any feedback. Have a good rest of your dev day.